Chapter 15 Last Transmission. He didn't broadcast that night. The radio was complete. He knew it was complete, the final connection made, the antenna running up through the window frame to the chimney stack, the variable capacitor calibrated, everything as it should be, but he didn't turn it on. He covered the chassis with the cloth the way he'd covered it in the early days when looking at it was doing something to him he wasn't ready to sustain, and he went to bed. And he lay in the dark with the memories arranged around him like the objects on his shelves, present and particular and his. He needed one night with everything he now knew before he spoke into the silence. He thought that was reasonable. He slept and did not dream of the woman's voice because he knew now whose voice it was, and knowing changed the nature of it. Not lost, not reaching from somewhere he couldn't locate, just Mrs. Calloway Patricia, who had knocked 3 fast and 1 slow and brought chicken and rice and taken his hand deliberately and looked back from a car at a curb, and was somewhere maybe in Portland or past Portland or nowhere at all. He didn't know. He let himself not know. In the morning he woke before the light and lay still for a while in the way he'd always lain still in the morning, 1 minute between sleep and standing, the body remembering itself, and felt the familiarity of the habit from the inside for the first time. Not just a thing he did. A thing Henry had done. A thing Henry had read somewhere and kept doing because stopping would mean deciding to stop. He'd carried that all the way here without knowing he was carrying it. He got up. He made a fire and heated water and performed the morning in its order, the sequence of small acts that constituted a day beginning with intention, and this too he felt differently now, not performed, not automatic, but chosen. Each small act a choice renewed. The water heated, the cup held in both hands. The window and the suburb doing its early things, the birds, the light coming up gray and gradual in the east, and the city finding itself slowly in the growing clarity, the towers resolving from suggestion into fact. He stood at the window with his cup. He looked at the city for a long time. He'd looked at it every morning for months without fully looking at it, the way you stopped seeing the thing you looked at most. He looked at it now with the full attention of a man who knew what he was, and where he was, and what had happened between the city being inhabited and the city being this. The long, terrible sequence of it. The decisions and the documents and the factory floor and the unit standing in rows and the 45 seconds at a podium, and the phrase at this time said twice. And he felt the weight of it without being crushed by it, which was the best you could do with some weights. He drank his water. He went to the workbench. He took the cloth off. The chassis sat on the bench in the morning light, components visible through the housing, the wiring he'd run over weeks of careful work. The antenna lead ran up to the window frame and out. The variable capacitor caught the light and returned it. The toggle switches were in their rest positions. He sat down on the stool. He thought about what he was going to say. He'd thought about it before in the abstract, in the early weeks of the project when the radio had been a possibility rather than a thing, but he'd never thought about it as a thing he was actually about to do, as words that were going to leave this room and travel in all directions at once and arrive, or not arrive, wherever they were going to arrive. The thinking was different now, more specific. He had an audience in mind, even if the audience was theoretical, even if the audience was no one. He was going to speak to whoever was out there as if they were out there. He was going to speak to them as Henry, because that was who was speaking, and Henry had spent enough of his life being invisible. He turned on the radio. The static came first, the wide-open static of an unoccupied frequency, the sound of electromagnetic space with nothing human in it. He'd expected it, and it was still large when it came, the scale of it, the realness of the silence underneath the static. He adjusted the variable capacitor with small, careful movements, working through the frequencies, listening for anything that wasn't static. There was nothing that wasn't static. He set the frequency to the emergency band, the civilian emergency frequency that had been the standard for decades, the one that was supposed to be monitored, the one that emergency services and survival guides and every piece of literature on the subject said to use if you were ever in a situation where you needed to be found. He was in that situation. He keyed the transmitter. "This is a broadcast from the suburban district north of the city." His voice in the room. Strange to hear, familiar now in a way it hadn't been before, Henry's voice, the voice he'd always had. "I'm transmitting on the civilian emergency frequency. If you can hear this, please respond on this frequency." He released the key, he listened. Static. He keyed again. "My name is Henry." He paused for a moment with that, the name in the air, out of the room, traveling. I've been in the suburb for approximately 14 months. I have a shelter at the end of Mercer Court. It's a 2-story house, pale yellow siding at the cul-de-sac. It's structurally sound. There's water from the collection system I've built. There are supplies. He released the key. Static. I've mapped the area within a 2-mile radius. I know where the hazards are, the active units, the unstable structures, the sectors to avoid. I can share the map. He paused. There are safe routes in from the north and the west. The eastern approach is compromised but manageable if you know where to move. He was thinking of the jumpy one, the commercial strip, the route he'd learned to avoid. All the things he'd written down in the log, the months of careful observation that were in this radio now the same way they were in the map on the wall and the entries in the log, all of it available, all of it ready to be useful to someone if someone was there to use it. There is shelter here, he said. If you're out there, if you can hear this, there is shelter and there is someone here and you don't have to keep going alone. He released the key. He listened for a long time. The static held. It held with the complete indifference of a physical phenomenon, electromagnetic noise, the background radiation of a frequency with no one on it, a sound that didn't know it was a silence. He sat with his hand on the transmitter and listened, and the static gave him nothing. He broadcast again, the same information. The location, the shelter, the map, the routes. He said come and he said asterisk I'm here and he said this frequency, please respond. He broadcast and he listened and the static held and he broadcast again. He did this for 2 hours. In the second hour something happened. He wasn't sure. He wanted to be careful about being sure, wanted to hold the line between what he'd heard and what he wanted to have heard, because the distance between those two things was one of the few distances he still knew how to respect. He adjusted the variable capacitor one small increment and the static shifted in the way static shifted when you moved a dial, the frequency changing, the noise repatterning. And then, in the space between one pattern and the next, in the brief transit between one noise and another, something. Not a voice, not words, a variation in the static that had a different quality from the variations around it. A regularity, the briefest suggestion of something that was not random the way static was random but structured the way signals were structured. He held completely still. He held the capacitor where it was. He listened with everything he had. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the static resumed its uniformity and didn't vary again in the way it had varied, and he sat with his hand on the capacitor and couldn't tell. Genuinely, honestly, with the rigor he owed the question, whether what he'd heard was a signal or the pattern-seeking of a mind that wanted very badly to hear one. He didn't know. He broadcast again, his voice and the location and the shelter and come and I'm here. He broadcast it carefully and he listened and the static held. He set the radio to repeat. He'd built a simple timer into the circuit, one of the toggle switches keyed to a basic interval mechanism he'd assembled from components in the electronics shop. Every 20 minutes the transmitter would key itself and the broadcast would go out again. The same message, the same frequency, the same location and shelter and invitation. He'd recorded it into the mechanism that morning. His voice looped into the circuit, going out whether he was at the bench or not. Going out tonight while he slept. Going out tomorrow and the next day and the day after. He said it and he listened to the first automated cycle run, his own voice coming back to him from the speaker as the circuit keyed, strange to hear as a recorded thing, real in the way recorded things were real, and then he stood up. He went to the windowsill. The 7 shells in their positions. The afternoon light on them the way the afternoon light always fell on them, the colors coming up, the surfaces going luminous, the pale rose of the spiral pulling the eye in and in and in. He picked up the spiral. He held it in both hands. It was lighter than he expected. They always were. He turned it and the light moved through the groove of the spiral and he looked at it and remembered a beach in August and a hot day and a woman looking for sand dollars and a shell that was too big to carry. He remembered the weight of the decision to carry it anyway, the weight of the carrying. He held it now in hands that were not the hands that had found it and felt, with those hands, the exact truth of it. The shape that pulled your eye in and didn't let go, the spiral that had no end you could see, just the deepening, just the going further in. He stood there for a while. He went outside. The afternoon was the suburb's usual afternoon, the light flat and gray, the trees moving in the small wind, the street empty in the way the street was always empty. His street, Mercer Court, the cul-de-sac, the house he'd found and made into something. He walked to the end of the cul-de-sac and stood where the street opened and the sightline extended east, the long straight road going toward the commercial strip and past it and eventually to the city. The towers there in the east catching the afternoon light the way they caught it every afternoon, present and silent and permanent. He stood with the shell in both hands and looked at the skyline. Behind him in the house the radio cycled, his voice going out. The location and the shelter and come and I'm here and the static receiving it and not answering, or answering in a way too small to hear, or answering in 4 seconds of variation that might have been a signal and might have been nothing. He didn't know. He was Henry, and he didn't know, and he was going to stand here anyway and look at the city, and hold the shell, and not know with the full presence of a man who had decided that not knowing was not the same as not trying, that the radio going out into the silence was not defeated by the silence, that the act of broadcasting was its own answer to the question of whether it was worth doing. He'd read that in a document once in a break room in another life. Or he hadn't, he'd written it maybe or understood it, or it had been true without anyone writing it, the kind of thing that was true before anyone found the words. It was worth doing because someone had to do it. Because the world needed someone to move through it and pay attention and not stop and call out into the silence and mean it. He meant it. The light changed. The city held its skyline against the graying sky, the towers patient and permanent, the distance between here and there exactly what it had always been, measurable, known, crossable if you knew the route. He knew the route. He stood at the end of Mercer Court with the shell in both hands and the collar on his wrist, and the radio going behind him and the map on the wall, and the log on the table, and the 7 shells on the windowsill, and the photographs of strangers keeping their vigil and the city in the east doing what the city did. He looked at it. He was still looking when the light went. The radio broadcast on the civilian emergency frequency every 20 minutes. It broadcast through the night and into the next morning and the morning after. Whether anyone heard it is not recorded. Whether the variation in the static in the second hour was a signal is not recorded. What is recorded is this: the broadcast continued, the map was accurate, the shelter on Mercer Court was structurally sound. And Henry was there.